Hi, I'm Jeannie Hebert-Brown, a licensed clinical social worker. I have been a social worker for over 50 years. I'm 80 years old now, and I'm still working because I love this career. I decided I would make a recollection of my life, but seen through the prism of my career in social work. I'm hoping that you'll find it interesting. If you have any questions, text me at 619 997 1616. Now, this part that I will be presenting to you is really not about social work. It's about the night that John Kennedy was assassinated. And it's really a redaction of a very long letter that I wrote to my girlfriend from high school, Lassie. It has nothing to do with social work, so you can skip it if you want to. I'm going to include it because it's one of those questions that people in my generation ask. Where were you on the night that Kennedy was shot? I'm going to split it in two parts, and I hope that'll make it more fun. So here's the letter that I wrote to Lassie. I was in Washington when President John Kennedy was assassinated. It was a Friday, and my then boyfriend Fred and I were on our way to spend a lovely afternoon at Mount Vernon, which is George Washington's estate home. We were having a wonderful time, and I was very happy. Crossing 10th Street, I saw a man holding a portable radio close to his ear, and I remember wondering if he were such an avid football fan that he couldn't be separated from his game for any reason. But now I realize that he had been informed of the shooting of the president. But in the bustle and the crowd of a Friday afternoon, one serious face made no great impression on me. We set out for Mount Vernon. Driving down Independence Avenue, I turned on the radio, and the announcer was discussing the shooter of the president. I was horrified, stunned, but I thought that with wonder drugs and the Secret Service, no one could really seriously hurt the president. The announcer kept switching back and forth from Washington, D.C. to Dallas to New York, and then from one of those cities, a quiet, solemn voice of authority interrupted the broadcast. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States is dead. In the silence following this announcement, I began to cry. I sobbed harder and louder than I imagined possible. I was crying as if a relative had died. Fred turned off Independence Avenue, and we stopped right in front of the Lincoln Memorial. He put his arms around me and whispered sympathetically, he never liked Kennedy, and he was an ardent Republican, so he didn't have the same emotional response. I felt sorrow for Kennedy's wife and children, as well as the loss of our leader, who made me feel as if the Democratic Party couldn't be all that bad. A colorful politician, the first Catholic president, a humorous, brilliant, strong man who filled his office with vigor and color, and who will be remembered for his attitudes in international trade, civil rights, Russian relations, cultural attempts, many other areas where he made his voice heard. Here is a man who is easy to eulogize and pay homage and tribute to. I wondered how many people knew and how many people were living unaware that in a moment they're going to find out and be engulfed in sorrow. I looked over to Lincoln, enshrined forever in man's hearts because he died a hero, and I wondered at history's ubiquitous question, how different would things have been if Lincoln had lived? How different would things be if John Kennedy were not dead? We drove across the bridge to Virginia and promptly became lost, so we stopped in Arlington at a drugstore to look up the address of a restaurant. And in the end, we just drove through a drive-through and ordered lunch. We were both sick of listening to the news, so we pretty much ate in silence. We decided to forego Mount Vernon and just drive into the country. It was a beautiful day. There was no wind. The air was soft. The trees were mostly naked and lacy against the light sky. In the morning, Fred called to say hello. My college suite mate, Jeannie Duncan, told me that school would be in mourning and would be closed on Monday. Sunday, I overslept. In 15 minutes, I was up and dressed for church in clothes not nearly warm enough for the coldness of the day. We wanted to see the funeral cortege, which began at 1 p.m. and reached where we were standing by 1:15 p.m. And in that space of time, I nearly froze. We all stood together in a frozen mass, waiting for the funeral procession that we were curious to see, but wished had never happened. We were anxious, cold, curious, sad. The crowd talked to each other, questioning people nearest about the shooting of Oswald in Dallas. There was no loud talking except a vendor who was selling pictures of John Kennedy for a quarter. A few people bought pictures, but as the vendor walked near our corner, someone, a man, spoke in a loud, forceful tone, "There should be no commercialism today," and the vendor walked away. In the distance, we could hear the boom of drums. The police kept us on the curb while we strained forward. The drums thudded in the air long before they came into view. First marched the D.C. police, then some various military men, then the drummers with all the drums draped in black. 9 white horses pulled the casket. Some had riders, and all were brightly colored. The casket was small and was wrapped almost engulfed in the flag with brilliant red and white stripes. It seemed almost unfitting for a funeral. In the rear came the president's flag, and in the brisk, windy day it flapped taut and straight backward. The riderless horse came last. Seeing the horse, confused and shy and unhappy with all the noise and the people, I knew the president had not ridden a horse, but somehow the horse, unsteady without the weighted guidance of his rider, struck me deeply, and I began to cry, cold tears, no handkerchief. Black cars followed. Jackie was clearly visible. An audible gasp of recognition could be heard. Her head was tilted forward. She looked sad. We returned to Strong Hall and heard there was going to be a candlelight flashlight service at Lafayette Park on Sunday. Emmy had gone to Dulles Airport to see Charles de Gaulle. Sandy had waited in line 7.5 hours to see the casket. We asked for an extended curfew to go at night to see the casket, but we were denied because of official confusion, but we went anyway. That evening, Karen Strathern, Jerry Shepard, and I went to Devon's apartment to cook dinner. Jerry was the only one of us who knew how to cook at all, and her repertoire for dinner was chicken with sliced onions smothered in ketchup, cooked in a fry pan. At 10:30 p.m., we set out in Devon's car to see the line around the casket and decide where we were going to spend the night. The area around the Capitol is famous for crime, but there couldn't have been any crimes on that Sunday night because there were so many people. The long line to see the president's casket was fantastic. I wouldn't have believed it if I had not seen it with my own eyes. There were people in line for at least 2.5 miles. The line was packed. You could not squeeze one extra person in that line. There were women, babies, children, grandmothers, invalids, more people than you can imagine, just standing in line, headed for 10 blocks away from the Capitol, then twisting around the square, cutting back towards the Capitol. The end was nowhere visible. We tried to follow the line in the car, but we finally gave up. At some points, the line seemed to be moving. At other points, it stood still, but the end was nowhere visible. All I could say was, I don't believe this. We returned to the dorm. If the weather had been better, if the line had been shorter, perhaps I would have waited, because I did love JFK. But somehow, a tribute to a coffin is not much of a tribute.